So the readings today are very rich, and I'd like to spend some time with the first reading and then make our way through the Gospel today. The first reading has almost, if you like, two parts to it. And the one part is how it emphasizes darkness and so on. And the other part emphasizes a light, for example, that shines. So I want to spend some time on this first reading because in many ways it makes sense of Christmas and what we are celebrating. I also want to dwell a bit more on that one parallel that focuses on the darkness. And I'll do so for a moment because we need to remember, we need to understand what our human experience is, and therefore we will understand why Christ, through Jesus, has come. So let's pause for a moment and perhaps bring ourselves into the present moment and recollect where we are. Where have we been? And I'm going to use some of the words of the first reading, and maybe you'll resonate with some of them. The first reading tells us about darkness, about a deep shadow existing. Do we find ourselves in any darkness right now, individually or even on a global level? That first reading goes on and talks about the rod of oppression. Do we experience oppression in any way? I'm talking about a social level, a global level, but also at a personal level, weighed down perhaps by anxiety or fear. And then there is the expression of clothes that are tainted with blood. There is the expression of battle and boots trampling through battle. In any way, can we relate to these expressions that we find in the first reading today? And let's add to some of these expressions. A part of our human lives, we experience disappointment. We are sometimes overwhelmed, perhaps even to the point of despair and hopelessness. Perhaps we're really impacted by the imperfection in the world, the brokenness that exists, our sense of weakness and vulnerability in the face of so much, such as the pandemic, obviously. And then that first reading goes on to say, the light has shone in the darkness, that the rod has been broken, that there is now joy that has been released, that rejoicing in the presence of God happens, and that those blood-stained clothes are burnt. What does this mean for us at Christmas time and through the coming of Jesus? Now, if you were to be asked, what is the message of Jesus or Christmas? I wondered what you would say. What names come to mind about Jesus at this time? And I'm sure one of them would be Emmanuel, which means God with us. So Christmas time is telling us something about God with us. In other parts of the Hebrew scriptures, we hear that God pitched God's tent among the people. God, in other words, dwells among us. So God is here and now, and God is near, and God is with us in our human suffering, in our human way, and in our human experience. But again, I must ask, how does that help me? How does that help me in my faith and in living out my faith? To know that God is with me. Sometimes I'm tempted to say, thank you for feeling how I'm feeling and empathizing, but I actually need an answer. I need things to be fixed. So again, what does Christmas mean when this is our reality? We need to pause a little bit and look at our images, our understanding of God, and see perhaps what new image, what new understanding is being revealed to us today through Christmas. How do you think that God responds to suffering? Throughout the whole of the Hebrew scriptures, and even up until today, I'm sure that many of us have defaulted to perhaps thinking that God sometimes doesn't care, that God is somehow distant or absent, that perhaps when we go through suffering it is a test, that it has some kind of value or virtue in it because it teaches us how to be strong and independent. The question remains, what about God who is with us? Is God affected and impacted by our human experiences? Elizabeth Johnson talks about a new, if you like, image of God, and that this God with us is a suffering God, meaning more that this God is a feeling one, who feels, is impacted, is affected by us. This is not a distant God. This is a God who prioritizes relationship. This is a God who desires to be in relationship with me, that I have a role to play, that God is waiting for my response. There is a mutuality that is now introduced through Christmas. When we hear that God is with us, we hear about a God who is accompanying us. But more than that, it is God who now really gets it, who really understands what it means to be a human being through and in Jesus. It is in Jesus' life that we see how God feels pain, God cries, God laments, God is a victim of political and religious systems. And then in Jesus' body, we see violence done to his body at the end of his life. In other words, Jesus, God, will really understand what it's like, for example, when a woman is abused, is raped, for example. God really understands us. This God with us, this solidarity, is not just simply a fact-finding mission of God. Well, now I know, so therefore I can give a strategic response. It's not about that. This knowingness of God draws God to us and vice versa. God joins with us in our pain and our suffering and our various struggles. How is this a source of power? Well, let's imagine for a moment perhaps a really powerful friendship, relationship that you've experienced, where you have been loved and seen and known. That experience awakens you. It feels like you're a new person. There are parts of you that you have not experienced. We awaken to our worth and our value, and in the context of God, who we really are. Now, this awareness changes how we live our lives, how we engage and see others. And in our growing awareness, we will look around and all of a sudden perhaps start asking questions. We may start feeling things for those who are degraded, for systems that oppress. When God engages with us, we are moved to compassion with others. Childbirth, as we see in the gospel, yes, it's about a suffering, but it brings hope. In other words, this God who joins with us is constantly telling us there is hope, there is resurrection, things always change. We are consoled, we are affirmed, we are reminded that this world and being human is good because God desired to be human. God with us, God in relationship with us, releases the very best within us. This is transforming. This experience is transformational. Our natural position is that we are good and that we are loved and we are made for love. This is what is released with God with us. What is our response now at this Christmas time? What are we being invited into? Perhaps it's an invitation to reflect on, how do I see God? Is God this remote figure, not involved in my life, perhaps sometimes judging? Or do we have the sense of God with us at a really intimate level? Perhaps the invitation is to explore that image and to trust this relationship more. Perhaps it's an invitation to become disturbed, to see the injustice and the unfairness and anything that hurts my neighbor and to rail against it, to say it is not okay. Perhaps Christmas is a time to start again. We've had a hard year. Let's pause in this year and start again. Clear the pathways. Trust God. Open up to a deeper faith in what might be unfolding in your life. That first reading ends with the line, in one translation, the zeal of God. In another translation of the text, it talks about the jealous love of God. This is the love that we believe in, that we hope in, and that we are told about today. This jealous love of God, who desires to be with us in relationship, waits for our response, is close, and tells us that all is good